The story of Ruth is often described as one of the most beautiful and moving accounts in the entire Bible. Though it spans only a few short chapters, it carries within it truths that touch the deepest places of the human heart. Many see it simply as a love story, but when read with care, it reveals far more. It is a testimony of loyalty, faith, and the extraordinary way God weaves redemption into the lives of ordinary people. Hidden between the days of the judges and the rise of kings, this small book shines with timeless significance, speaking to every generation. At its heart, Ruth's story shows us that even in seasons of emptiness, God is working behind the scenes. It begins in famine, loss, and bitterness, yet it ends in fullness, joy, and legacy. This contrast reminds us that God's purposes are never defeated by hardship. Just as He brought light into Ruth's darkness, He continues to bring hope into ours. The very fact that such a small, personal story sits within the grand narrative of Scripture shows how deeply God values the faith of those who trust Him. What makes Ruth's story especially powerful is how personal it feels. It is not about armies or kingdoms, but about widows and harvest fields, about loyalty in the midst of loss, and about small decisions that carry eternal weight. When Ruth chose to walk with Naomi, she had no idea that her faithfulness would lead her into the very lineage of the Messiah. This shows us that God can take even the quiet moments of devotion and turn them into history-shaping events. The book of Ruth also reflects God's heart for the outsider. Ruth was a Moabite, someone from a nation often at odds with Israel. Yet she was welcomed not only into the people of God, but also into His plan of salvation. Her life testifies that redemption is not limited by background, nationality, or circumstance. Anyone who chooses faith and loyalty to God can be written into His story. As we explore this narrative, we are invited to reflect on our own journey. Where have we faced emptiness? What decisions are we called to make in faith? And how might God be weaving redemption into our lives in ways we cannot yet see? Ruth's story encourages us to walk forward with courage, to trust God's hand even when the road feels uncertain, and to believe that His purposes for us are good. Before we go deeper, I encourage you to subscribe to this channel so you can continue to explore more inspiring biblical teachings. If you enjoy these kinds of messages, give this video a like to help share it with others, and leave a comment below about what speaks most to you from the story of Ruth. Your support helps this message reach more people, and together we can keep discovering the hidden jewels of Scripture. The opening of Ruth introduces us not with joy or triumph, but with hunger, grief, and dislocation. A famine strikes Bethlehem, the very house of bread, forcing a family to leave the land that had been given to them by promise. Elimelech, his wife Naomi, and their 2 sons journey into the land of Moab, a place often viewed with suspicion and tension by Israel. Their choice to seek survival beyond the borders of their homeland already sets the tone for a story born out of desperation. It is a reminder that life often thrusts us into unfamiliar territories, not out of desire, but necessity, as circumstances compel movement. The story quickly deepens in sorrow. Elimelech, the head of the household, dies in this foreign land, leaving Naomi as a widow. Still, hope lingers through her sons, who marry Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth. For a brief time, it seems stability might be restored, yet the shadow of loss remains near. Within a decade, both sons also die, leaving Naomi with her 2 daughters-in-law in a place that was never meant to be her permanent home. Her family tree is cut down, and her heart is pierced with grief that seems unbearable. For Naomi, this is not just a personal tragedy, but a collapse of her identity and future. In the ancient world, sons carried the family's name and security, and without them, Naomi's life becomes marked by emptiness. Her very name, which means pleasant, now feels like a cruel irony, for nothing about her circumstances appears pleasant. She describes herself later as bitter, believing that the hand of the Lord has turned against her. Such raw honesty reminds us that Scripture does not shy away from human pain, but allows it to be voiced, to be seen, and to be understood. The famine that drove her family away had already stripped her of stability, but death now strips her of companionship and inheritance. She is left with nothing but the companionship of two young widows who themselves stand in uncertainty. This backdrop of desolation creates the very canvas upon which redemption will later be painted. It is in the darkest valleys that the seeds of new beginnings are often planted, even when unseen by human eyes. The road back to Bethlehem becomes Naomi's only choice. She hears that the famine has ended in her homeland, that bread has returned to the house of bread, and so she prepares to return. Yet this journey is more than physical. It is spiritual, a pilgrimage marked by pain, but also by the faint glimmer of hope. The road ahead is uncertain, but it carries the potential for divine encounter. Naomi urges her daughters-in-law to remain in Moab, to return to their families and rebuild their lives. Her reasoning is practical, for she has nothing left to give them, no sons to offer, no future to promise. Orpah eventually weeps, kisses her, and returns to her people, a decision that carries no condemnation but reflects the weight of Naomi's situation. Ruth, however, does not turn back. The loss and emptiness of these opening scenes should not be overlooked. They mirror the seasons of life when everything feels stripped away, when grief overshadows joy, and when the future appears uncertain. Yet in the midst of this barrenness, God is preparing something unseen. The story reminds us of Psalm 34, verse 18, which says that the Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. Naomi could not yet see it, but even in Moab, even in widowhood, the Lord was near. The shattered beginning of Ruth is essential, for it shows that redemption does not start from a place of strength or abundance, but from brokenness. The journey of faith often begins in the valley, not the mountaintop. And it is in this valley that Ruth's loyalty and decision will soon shine as a beacon, changing the direction of the story and revealing the hidden work of God. Naomi's road back to Bethlehem is not only her journey, it becomes the stage upon which Ruth will make a choice that alters history. What begins in emptiness is not destined to remain so. The God who allows famine is the same God who brings harvest, and the God who permits sorrow is also the one who brings restoration. The road ahead may appear heavy with grief, but it is already aligned with providence. This is the paradox of faith, that even when life seems shattered, the unseen hand of God is already writing redemption into the brokenness. The opening chapters of Ruth remind us that no loss is final when God is still at work, and no emptiness is beyond his ability to fill. At the crossroads of return, the narrative shifts toward Ruth, the Moabite widow, whose loyalty and devotion emerge as the heartbeat of the story. When Naomi urges both young women to remain in Moab, Ruth refuses to be dissuaded. Her words, recorded for all generations, rise with clarity and conviction. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. In this declaration lies a depth that surpasses cultural obligation. It is not merely an attachment to Naomi, but a step into covenant faith with the God of Israel. Ruth's choice is remarkable because it defies both logic and self-preservation. Remaining in Moab would have offered familiarity, family, and potential security. Traveling to Bethlehem meant entering an unfamiliar land where she would be marked as an outsider, a widow without protection or promise. Yet her heart was fixed. She was willing to leave behind her old identity, her former gods, and her nation's customs to embrace a future defined not by certainty, but by faith. The weight of this decision cannot be overstated. In a time when widows were vulnerable, Ruth's alignment with Naomi was an act of both sacrifice and courage. Her words ring with loyalty, but beneath them lies faith, the kind of faith described in Hebrews 11 verse 6, where it is said that without faith it is impossible to please God. Ruth was stepping into the unknown, trusting not in her own strength, but in the God whose name she had invoked. This moment is pivotal because it becomes the turning point of the entire narrative. Naomi had resigned herself to bitterness, convinced that the Almighty had dealt harshly with her, yet Ruth's loyalty interrupts that despair. She becomes a living testimony that God was still working, even when Naomi could not perceive it. The companionship Ruth offers is more than comfort. It is prophetic alignment with God's redemptive plan. The choice also demonstrates the power of individual decisions to shape destiny. One young widow's refusal to turn back altered not only her own life, but the lineage that would lead to David and ultimately to Christ. The lineage that would lead to David and ultimately to Christ. What seemed like a personal decision at a crossroads became a divine hinge upon which the future of nations would turn. It is a vivid reminder that faith-filled choices, even when costly, carry consequences far beyond what the eye can see. Ruth's words echo with a level of devotion often reserved for covenant vows. She was not entering casually, but binding herself with enduring commitment. Her resolve to follow Naomi extended even to death, for she declared that only death would separate them. Such steadfastness embodies the essence of loyalty, not a fleeting sentiment, but a lasting covenant. The journey to Bethlehem now takes on new meaning. Naomi does not return alone. She returns with Ruth, a Moabite woman who has chosen to share her fate. For the people of Bethlehem, this would soon be a visible sign of God's providence, though they could not yet see its full unfolding. Ruth's decision ensured that Naomi's emptiness would not be the end of her story. When Ruth walked away from Moab, she was walking into destiny, though she did not know it. Her faith led her forward step by step, aligning her with promises she had yet to see. This courage teaches us that faith is not always about understanding the full picture, but about choosing loyalty to God's ways, even when the future is uncertain. This bold decision becomes the defining moment of Ruth's life. It teaches us that one act of courage, rooted in loyalty and faith, can open doors to unimaginable redemption. The story of Ruth reminds us that God honors choices that align with His purposes, and He uses them to weave together His plans for salvation. Arrival in Bethlehem brings Ruth and Naomi into a new chapter of survival. With no husband and no sons to provide, Ruth steps into the humble work of gleaning. According to the law given in Leviticus, the poor and the foreigner were allowed to gather leftover grain from the fields. For Ruth, this labor was not glamorous but necessary. Yet it was through this act of survival that she walked into divine appointment. Ruth happens to glean in the field of Boaz, a wealthy landowner and relative of Elimelech. The phrasing of happened carries weight, for what appears as chance is in fact providence. In the ordinary rhythm of harvesting, God was orchestrating an encounter that would change her life. It was not through grand miracles or visions, but through the quiet faithfulness of daily work that Ruth met her destiny. Boaz notices her. He inquires about the foreign woman working diligently in his field. He learns of her loyalty to Naomi, of her commitment to leave her homeland and care for her mother-in-law. What strikes Boaz is not her beauty or her status, but her faithfulness and humility. He speaks to her with kindness, offering protection and provision, a stark contrast to the vulnerability she might have expected as a foreigner. The exchange between Boaz and Ruth reveals how God rewards faithfulness. Ruth had chosen loyalty over convenience, service over self, and her reputation had already preceded her. Boaz acknowledges the sacrifice she made and prays that the Lord would repay her for it. In his words, we hear echoes of Psalm 91 verse 1, which speaks of those who dwell in the shelter of the Most High finding rest under his shadow. Ruth, who had come seeking refuge, was already experiencing it through the favor of Boaz. Ruth's humility in this moment is striking. She falls to the ground in gratitude, astonished that Boaz would show kindness to her, a foreigner. Her posture reflects her heart, one not demanding recognition, but receiving grace with thanksgiving. This humility becomes a key element in her story, a quality that not only captures the attention of Boaz, but aligns her with the heart of God. The daily act of gleaning, repetitive and ordinary, becomes the stage for extraordinary unfolding. It is a reminder that God often moves in the routine moments of life. The field of Boaz was not just soil for barley, but soil for destiny. Ruth's diligence in gathering grain became the doorway to a divine relationship, one that would soon reveal the depth of redemption. The fields also symbolize how God provides in unexpected ways. Ruth did not know when she began gleaning that she would encounter Boaz, yet God had already arranged it. This reflects the truth of Proverbs 16 verse 9, which says that in their hearts humans plan their course, but the Lord establishes their steps. Ruth was walking into providence, guided by a hand she could not see. Naomi, upon hearing of Ruth's encounter with Boaz, begins to perceive the kindness of God once again. The woman who had declared herself bitter now tastes a glimpse of hope. The field becomes not just a place of provision, but a sign that God had not abandoned her. Through Ruth's humble actions, Naomi begins to see the threads of redemption being woven into her life once more. The fields of providence teach us that destiny often meets us in the ordinary places. It is not always in grand stages or mighty acts, but in the fields where faithfulness and humility dwell. Ruth's story reminds us that no act of obedience is too small for God to use, and no field is too ordinary for his providence to transform. As the story unfolds, the focus turns to Boaz, the relative who embodies the role of the kinsman redeemer. In the law of Israel, a close relative had the responsibility to redeem the land and name of a deceased family member. This provision was designed to protect families from losing their inheritance, ensuring that widows and the vulnerable were not left destitute. Yet while it was a legal duty, in Boaz, it becomes a picture of love and grace that goes beyond obligation. Naomi, perceiving the kindness of Boaz, begins to guide Ruth toward seeking his protection as a redeemer. This is not manipulation, but alignment with the law of God and the hope of restoration. Ruth, in humility, follows Naomi's counsel, approaching Boaz not with demand but with submission. Her actions at the threshing floor, laying at his feet and asking for covering, symbolize her appeal for redemption. It is a gesture of faith and vulnerability. Boaz responds not with reluctance, but with honor. He calls Ruth a woman of noble character, affirming her virtue and loyalty. What makes this significant is that Ruth is still an outsider, a Moabite, yet Boaz sees her through the lens of faith and character rather than origin. His willingness to redeem reflects a love that mirrors the heart of God, one that looks beyond labels and embraces with grace. The concept of the kinsman redeemer points prophetically to Christ. Just as Boaz had the right and the willingness to redeem Ruth, so Christ took on humanity to become our Redeemer. He did not act out of obligation but out of love, covering our brokenness with his righteousness and restoring what was lost through sin. Boaz's role becomes a foreshadowing of the gospel, where redemption is not earned but freely given. Ruth's approach to Boaz also teaches us about faith. She placed herself in a vulnerable position, trusting that he would act with integrity. In the same way, faith requires trust in the Redeemer, laying ourselves at his feet and seeking covering under his wings. The image of Ruth at Boaz's feet becomes a symbol of the believer's surrender before Christ. Boaz's words of reassurance bring peace to Ruth's heart. He promises to handle the matter of redemption, even acknowledging that another relative is technically first in line. His integrity shines, for he will not cut corners or act deceitfully, yet he also makes clear his desire to redeem Ruth if given the rightful opportunity. This combination of honor, love, and lawfulness displays the depth of his character. For Naomi, hearing of Boaz's response brings new hope. The woman who had called herself bitter now begins to taste sweetness once again. She recognizes that God's hand is orchestrating events, bringing them toward redemption in ways she could not have imagined. Through the kinsman redeemer, her family's name and inheritance stand on the threshold of restoration. The picture of Boaz as redeemer shows us that redemption is not cold duty, but warm covenant love. It is rooted in law, yet overflowing with grace. Just as Ruth was welcomed into covenant by Boaz, so too believers are welcomed into covenant by Christ, who covers our past, restores our future, and calls us his own. The role of the kinsman redeemer reminds us that God's plan for salvation is not distant or abstract, but deeply personal. He steps into our need, into our brokenness, and offers covering, identity, and inheritance. Boaz's love for Ruth is a window into the immeasurable love of Christ, a love that reaches beyond obligation to embrace with everlasting kindness. The transformation of Ruth's life becomes most visible when she moves from being a widow marked by loss to becoming the bride of Boaz. What begins as a story of emptiness now blossoms into fullness. This shift is not only about marital status, but about identity. Ruth, once a foreigner gleaning on the edges of the field, is now welcomed into covenant and honored in a way she could never have imagined. Her journey reflects how God takes what the world overlooks and raises it to a place of dignity and purpose. When Boaz secures the right to redeem Ruth, he does so publicly, in the presence of elders and witnesses. This act is significant because it ensures that her redemption is not hidden or uncertain, but established before the community. Ruth, who had entered Bethlehem as an outsider, now receives a place of honor through this covenant. Her transformation is complete, no longer Ruth the Moabite widow, but Ruth the wife of Boaz, embraced and celebrated. This change in identity also restores Naomi's household. Through Ruth's union with Boaz, the family line that seemed extinguished is revived. The name of Elimelech is preserved, and the inheritance once thought lost is secured. For Naomi, who had felt empty and bitter, this marriage becomes a tangible sign of God's faithfulness. It is as if the barren fields of her life have suddenly burst into harvest, testifying that the Lord never forgets his people. Ruth's elevation from widow to bride carries deep symbolic meaning. In many ways, it reflects the spiritual reality of redemption. Humanity, broken and estranged, is brought into covenant relationship with Christ, the Redeemer. Just as Ruth found covering and belonging in Boaz, believers find covering and belonging in Christ. The imagery of moving from widowhood to bridehood points to transformation through covenant love. The story also highlights the dignity of those who remain faithful in obscurity. Ruth never pursued greatness or recognition. She simply walked in humility, loyalty, and faith, yet her character opened the way for God to elevate her. This truth echoes James 4, verse 10, which says that those who humble themselves before the Lord will be lifted up. Ruth's humility was the soil in which her transformation blossomed. The marriage of Ruth and Boaz also reflects God's heart for inclusion. Ruth was a Moabite, a foreigner by every standard, yet she was welcomed not just into a family, but into the covenant community of Israel. This acceptance points to God's greater plan of redemption, where the dividing lines between nations and peoples would be broken down through Christ, opening the way for all who believe to be brought into his family. For Naomi, the transformation of Ruth is inseparable from her own restoration. The same woman who had declared that she went away full but returned empty now witnesses abundance. Through Ruth's marriage, Naomi's life is filled with joy and security once more. What had been marked by sorrow is now marked by celebration, and the once bitter heart is softened by the sweetness of God's providence. The transition from widow to bride reminds us that God delights in rewriting stories. He takes the rejected, the forgotten, the overlooked, and he places them in positions of honor. Ruth's life demonstrates that no past, no loss, no label can prevent the unfolding of his redemptive plan. Her transformation was not accidental, but intentional, orchestrated by the same God who brings life out of death and fullness out of emptiness. The covenant Ruth entered with Boaz was not only for her time, but also for the generations to come. This transformation of identity was not a temporary blessing, but the foundation of a legacy that would extend far beyond her own life. In becoming Boaz's bride, Ruth became part of a story far greater than herself, one that would ripple into the future of Israel and the world. Ruth's transformation calls us to reflect on the nature of redemption itself. It is not merely about survival or relief from hardship, but about restoration, dignity, and covenant love. What happened to Ruth points to what God does for every soul that comes to him in faith. He does not leave us in the place of widowhood, but calls us into the joy of being his own, clothed with honor and embraced in everlasting covenant. The story of Ruth does not end with her marriage to Boaz. It blossoms into a legacy that stretches far beyond their generation. From their union comes a son named Obed, and with his birth, the thread of redemption weaves into the broader tapestry of Israel's history. Obed becomes the father of Jesse, who becomes the father of David, Israel's greatest king. Through this lineage, the Messiah himself would come. What began with famine, loss, and exile now flows into a heritage of promise that touches eternity. The birth of Obed is celebrated not only as a personal blessing, but as a communal joy. The women of Bethlehem gather around Naomi, declaring that the Lord has not left her without a redeemer. They recognize the significance of this child, for through him the name of Naomi's family is restored. Naomi, who once felt empty, now holds new life in her arms. This image of her cradling Obed reflects the tender mercy of God, who turns mourning into joy and fills emptiness with abundance. Obed's place in history is extraordinary because he links Ruth's story to the throne of David. The foreign widow who chose faith over familiarity becomes the great-grandmother of the king, after God's own heart. This connection reveals how God uses unexpected people to bring about his purposes. Ruth's loyalty and humility set in motion a legacy that shaped the destiny of Israel and the world. The significance of this lineage extends beyond David. In Matthew 1, the genealogy of Jesus Christ includes Ruth by name. The Gospel writers ensure that her story is remembered, not as a footnote, but as an essential part of the Messiah's heritage. Through Ruth, we see that God's plan of redemption has always included the outsider, always embraced the nations, and always worked through the faithful choices of ordinary people. The birth of legacy in Ruth's story is not accidental, but intentional. It demonstrates that the decisions made in faith ripple far beyond one lifetime. Ruth could not have foreseen that her loyalty to Naomi would result in her place within the Messiah's lineage. Yet God was weaving her story into his eternal plan. It reminds us of Ephesians 3, verse 20, which speaks of God doing immeasurably more than we ask or imagine. Naomi's restoration is also part of this legacy. Her bitterness is turned to joy, her emptiness to fullness, and her family name preserved through Obed, she becomes a testimony to future generations that the Lord's kindness never fails. The women of Bethlehem affirm this truth, declaring the goodness of God in her life. Through Naomi, we learn that no season of sorrow is wasted, for God can turn even the darkest chapters into the foundation of legacy. Ruth's inclusion in the genealogy of Christ reveals a profound truth about redemption. It is not limited by human boundaries. She was a Moabite, a woman whose people had often stood against Israel, yet she is woven into the very lineage of salvation. Her presence testifies that the grace of God reaches beyond barriers, extending to all who place their trust in Him. This legacy also points forward to Christ, the ultimate Redeemer. Just as Ruth found her place in covenant through Boaz, humanity finds its place in covenant through Jesus. The birth of Obed, leading to David and then to Christ, demonstrates that God's plan of salvation is both personal and global. It redeems individuals while shaping history for generations. The story of Ruth, culminating in legacy, reminds us that no act of faith is small. Ruth's loyalty on a dusty road to Bethlehem, her humility in the fields, her courage at the threshing floor, each decision was part of the pathway to a legacy that would transform the world. What seemed ordinary was in fact eternal. Through Ruth's legacy, we see the faithfulness of God not only to individuals but to the world. Her story assures us that when we walk in faith and loyalty, we become part of something far greater than ourselves. Like Ruth, our lives can ripple into eternity, carrying the mark of redemption into generations yet to come. The unfolding of Ruth's story brings us to a secret that lies beneath the surface of every event. Redemption is written in loyalty, faith, and humility. Ruth's legacy is not simply that she became the great-grandmother of David or that she entered the lineage of Christ, but that her life testifies to the transforming power of steadfast devotion and faithful choices. The secret of her story is that loyalty, when rooted in love and faith, becomes the pathway through which God's redemption flows. From the moment Ruth clung to Naomi on the road back to Bethlehem, her loyalty stood as the defining mark of her character. She was not compelled by duty but by love, and in that love she found a place in God's plan. Loyalty to Naomi led her to Bethlehem. Loyalty kept her in the fields, gleaning day after day, and loyalty guided her steps when she approached Boaz with humility. Each act of devotion became a stepping stone toward redemption. The secret is that loyalty opens the door to God's purposes. Ruth's story also reveals that humility is inseparable from redemption. She never demanded recognition or honor. Instead, she received kindness with gratitude and sought refuge under the wings of the God of Israel. In a culture that often overlooked widows and foreigners, her humility shone brightly. Boaz noticed her character not because she sought the spotlight, but because she walked faithfully in the shadows. This secret truth reminds us that God exalts the humble and uses their lives to display His grace. The secret of Ruth is also found in her faith. She left behind the security of Moab, choosing to align herself with a people and a God she had come to believe in. Faith empowered her to walk into the unknown, and in that faith, she discovered providence waiting in the fields of Boaz. Her story teaches us that redemption is not the result of chance, but of faith that clings to God in every season, trusting His unseen hand. In Ruth's loyalty and Boaz's redemption, we find a reflection of the greater story of salvation. Just as Ruth was redeemed by Boaz's covenant love, so humanity is redeemed by Christ, our Redeemer. The love of Jesus is not obligation but grace, not duty but delight, a love that covers shame, restores identity, and establishes covenant. Ruth's story is a prophetic picture of this greater redemption, reminding us that the loyalty of faith leads directly to the embrace of divine love. The secret also lies in the fact that God weaves redemption into ordinary lives. Ruth was not a queen or a prophet. She was a widow gathering grain, yet her story shows that God delights to write his purposes into the lives of those who walk in faith, no matter how unnoticed they may seem. Redemption is not limited to the mighty, but is offered to the humble and faithful. Naomi's restoration further underscores this secret. Her sorrow was turned into joy, her emptiness into fullness, her bitterness into sweetness. Through Ruth's loyalty and Boaz's redemption, Naomi discovered that God had not forsaken her. This truth speaks across time. No matter how dark the beginning, God's story always bends toward redemption. The secret of Ruth invites us to see our own lives in the light of her journey. Each act of loyalty, each step of faith, each moment of humility can become part of a greater story of redemption. Even when circumstances seem ordinary or painful, God is writing a narrative that leads to fullness and legacy. Like Ruth, we may not see the full picture, but we can walk faithfully, trusting that redemption is being woven into our lives. Ruth's story closes, but its message continues. Loyalty matters, humility matters, faith matters. These are the threads that God uses to write redemption into human history. The woman from Moab became a mother in Israel, a link in the chain to the Messiah because she chose loyalty and faith. This is the secret of Ruth, that redemption is not distant but present, not abstract but personal, and it begins with choices rooted in love. The story of Ruth is more than history. It is a living testimony of how God turns loss into legacy and emptiness into fullness. Her loyalty, humility, and faith reveal the secret of redemption that still speaks to us today. Just as Ruth discovered her destiny in ordinary fields, so too can our lives become the ground where God writes his purposes when we walk in faith. If this message has touched your heart, I encourage you to subscribe to the channel so you never miss future teachings and reflections. Give this video a like to support its reach. Share it with your loved ones so they too can be uplifted by the message. And leave a comment below sharing what part of Ruth's story speaks most deeply to you. Your interaction not only strengthens this community, but also spreads the timeless message of hope and redemption found in Scripture.